The snow up here didn't fall so much as it hovered, fine grains suspended in daylight like someone had shaken a sheet over the mountains and never stopped. The sun was high enough to turn every ridge into a mirror. Snow glare flooded the shallow valley until distance lost its edges, until rock and ice and sky blended into one hard, bright field that hurt to look at. The convoy sat in the worst possible place, a bowl shaped by two rising shoulders of rock, vehicles tucked tight where the road dipped and the banks rose on either side. 3 trucks, 1 armored SUV. A lead vehicle angled half sideways like it had tried to push through a drift and failed. The engines were off now, or drowned out, because nothing moved the way it had moved minutes earlier. Everything had snapped into stillness and survival. Rounds cracked from above, sharp and clean. Not random, not frantic. The impact stitched the snow around the vehicles in neat, cruel lines, too consistent to be luck. Date and ice popped up in small bursts, each puff telling the same story. Someone had walked this road in their mind, measured the angles, rehearsed how the convoy would react. The security team was small. A handful of operators in winter gear, faces masked, rifles pressed to shoulders that shook from exertion and cold. They moved in tight, protective arcs around one figure who never raised his voice. He didn't need to. The pressure around him was its own language. Bodyguards crouched lower than everyone else. Hands guided him, pulled him, shoved him behind whatever cover existed. The man at the center wore the kind of plain uniform that looked more expensive for its simplicity. He kept his head down. He didn't wave a pistol or shout orders. He was being moved like a package that could not be dropped. A radio chirped. Static. A syllable that might have been a call sign. Then the sound turned into a rasping wash, like wind through a broken vent. Another radio tried to cut in. Then it died too, swallowed in layers. It didn't fail all at once. It failed in waves. The team leader, broad shoulders, a white band of tape on his arm, pressed his push-to-talk again and again. Nothing came out but a hiss. He looked up at the ridgeline as if he could see the problem in the air. Hence signals started. A fist, 2 fingers, a chopping motion toward the rear vehicle. Heads nodded. Nobody spoke, not because they didn't want to, but because words were useless now. Wind tore sound apart. The snow glare ruined depth. The radios were dead. Every decision had to be made with hands, with eye contact, with the old instinct that lived underneath training. Then the crew-served gun announced itself. It wasn't just louder. It was heavier. The rhythm changed. A long, controlled burst that walked its fire across the only track that led out of the bowl. Snow erupted in a continuous line as if an invisible rake had dragged teeth across the valley floor. The exit lane became a strip of detonating ice and flying grit. Nobody could sprint through that. Nobody could drive through that. The road might as well have been cut away. A man at the rear vehicle tried to shift position, half rising to move a wounded teammate. He didn't even clear the vehicle door before a single shot snapped and he folded, dropping hard. Not dead. His leg took it, and blood darkened the snow almost immediately. He screamed, and the scream should have owned the valley. But the wind swallowed it. It turned into something thin and distant, like a fox call heard through a storm. The sight of his mouth open wide was worse than the sound. He clutched his thigh with both hands, eyes wide, pleading without words for anyone to do something while bullets stitched the snow around him and made every movement a gamble. Smoke went out next. 2 canisters lobbed into the open. Gray plumes started to build, promising a curtain. The cold air shredded it. Wind peeled the smoke away in strips, thinning it, turning it into uneven veils that revealed and concealed in the same second. One moment there was cover. The next there was nothing but bright snow again. The smoke didn't create safety. It created uncertainty. They moved the general anyway. The bodyguards grabbed his sleeves and harnessed him toward a rock outcrop on the right side of the bowl. It was the only thing that looked like hard cover from where they were, dark stone pushing up through white. The general bent low, boots digging in, face turned away from the wind. The rock outcrop was already bracketed. Rounds landed left and right of it in a pattern, so tight it might have been drawn with a ruler. Impacts chipped stone. Snow puffed in precise bursts. Whoever was shooting had already decided that this was where the team would run. This was the safe choice, and it had been made unsafe before they arrived. The escort leader threw out another hand signal, tight and sharp. Fall back. Spread. A finger pointed to the front vehicle. Someone needed to push it, clear it, create movement. But movement drew fire. Every attempt at initiative got slapped down by disciplined bursts from above. For a moment, the fight narrowed. Not to the whole valley, not to the whole convoy. To one small triangle of space behind the armored SUV, where the general's cover was failing and the bodyguards were running out of options. Snow around them was churned into slush and grit. Shattered ice glittered like broken glass. A rifle magazine clattered when someone fumbled it, and the sound seemed too loud in the spaces between shots. And then, in the midst of all that, the narration of the world found a different detail. A figure posted slightly apart, not in the center of the cluster, not shouting, not signaling, crouched behind a low drift with a rifle held close, her body quiet as if she belonged to the snow itself. She wasn't watching the obvious threat, the muzzle flashes from the high ridge line that everyone else was firing at. Her gaze kept cutting to a specific spine of rock farther left, a ridge that looked empty in the glare. Her stillness was strange in a place where everyone else moved like prey. An RPG team tested the vehicles. The hiss came first. Then the blast hit the lead truck, punching into the snow bank beside it with a concussion that threw snow dust and fragments into the air. The world went white for a second, white-out from the explosion, not the weather. Orientation collapsed. A bodyguard stumbled, grabbed the SUV, regained footing. Somewhere in the whiteness a radio spit a broken fragment. Bird, 10, window. Then it died. The hiss returned. Nothing else. The general's cover started to fail in a way that made everyone feel it at once. The outcrop that was supposed to protect him was being chipped and cratered. A bodyguard leaned to fire and was forced back by immediate impacts. The kill zone geometry tightened. The Crusoe gun walked its fire again across the exit lane, daring them to move. Time squeezed. And then, through the wind and the crackle of distant rifles, a single shot snapped. Not a burst. Not an exchange. One clean, final sound like a nail driven into wood. The heaviest enemy fire stuttered. It didn't stop completely, but it hesitated, just long enough for the escort leader to see the opening and act on it with a kind of speed that only happens when instinct and training align. He lunged forward, hauled the general by the harness, dragged him behind a deeper fold in the terrain, an angle the enemy didn't have, a pocket the earlier brackets hadn't punished. That half-second of silence was all it took. The general was yanked into cover. 2 bodyguards followed. Another threw himself on top of the wounded man's legs to apply pressure. The convoy shifted. Tiny movements, but movements with purpose. Nobody looked up to thank whoever had fired that shot because nobody even knew where it had come from. All they knew was that the fight had changed shape. Something had reached into the enemy's machine and pulled a wire. And somewhere, on that specific ridge line the quiet figure had been watching, a small dark shape had gone still. Hours earlier, the mountains had looked harmless. In the gray-blue pre-dawn, snow lay smooth and untouched along the corridor road, like a blank page. The air held that metallic stillness that meant cold was deep and honest. Breath turned to crystals. Footprints squeaked. The sky brightened slowly, and as the sun climbed, the world became brighter and more dangerous. The mission brief happened in a cramped room that smelled of coffee, damp wool, and vehicle exhaust drifting in from the motor pool. A map of the corridor was pinned to a board, the route marked in thick lines. The remote sensor site sat at the end of the line like a dot of significance in a wilderness that didn't care. A visiting general was coming to inspect the site and meet a local partner element who helped maintain the sensors. The sensors watched a pass that hostile groups used to move supplies. They weren't glamorous. They were small boxes bolted to rock, listening more than seeing, feeding data back through a network that lived and died on reliable links. The general wanted to see it with his own eyes. The command wanted him in and out before the afternoon weather shifted, before the mountains did what mountains always did and reminded people who was in charge. The convoy was small by design, a clean footprint, minimal attention. The security detail was tight. The escort leader did most of the talking, voice steady, hands drawing lines on the map. She sat near the edge of the group, half in shadow, cleaning the snow crust out of her rifle's action with a small brush. The others didn't ignore her completely. They just treated her like background, useful, quiet, not part of the main conversation. Extra magazines, someone said, nodding at her pack. If we get sticky, you're the mule. A couple of chuckles. She didn't laugh. She checked the optic once more, adjusting for temperature, full glare. The glass was older than some of the men in the room. It didn't have the newest coatings. It didn't have the bells and whistles that people love to list. But it held zero. It tracked. It worked if you treated it right. Her name was Harper, and in the unit's social hierarchy, her most famous detail was a failure. Not a failure in a firefight. Not a failure on patrol. A failure on paper. She had failed sniper school. The way people said it mattered. They said it like a verdict, like a stain. They didn't say what actually happened because they didn't know, and they didn't ask because the answer wouldn't fit the tidy narrative they liked. Talented shooter choked under pressure, washed out, relegated to supporting roles. The escort leader glanced at her when he spoke about Overwatch positions, but he didn't invite her into the planning circle. We stay on the marked track, the general's aide said, voice clipped, like he was reading from a checklist. Spacing stays tight but not bunched. Quick stop at the site. Meet the local partner. Exfil before 1300. The weather shifts after that. We do not linger. The map showed ridges that pressed in on the road from both sides. The corridor wasn't a valley so much as a cut in the mountain. Any movement on the road would be seen from above. Snowdrifts made false cover. A drift might hide you from one angle and expose you to another. Bright daylight glare made spotting movement harder in a strange way. The world was so bright that contrast disappeared. A human shape could become a shadow and vanish. Harper studied the map differently than the others. They looked at routes. She looked at lines of sight. Her finger traced ridges, angles, places where a shooter could lie and command the road without being seen. She marked mentally where a jammer could sit and poison the air, where a crew-serve gun could set a no-move line, where a kill zone could be shaped so a convoy would choose the wrong cover and be punished for it. She pointed once, quietly. That stretch, she said. It's too clean, too quiet. High ground on both shoulders. If I was setting a trap. The escort leader cut her off with a small shake of the head. Not the lead, he said. Not cruel, just dismissive. You're seeing ghosts. He didn't mean harm. He meant that he had a timeline and a general and a dozen moving parts. He meant that the mission had been run before, that hostile groups were active but predictable, that sensors and patrols had kept the corridor mostly quiet. Harper nodded. She didn't argue. She checked her spare radio earpiece and felt it crackle as she adjusted it. It had been finicky for weeks. Sometimes it cut out in the cold. Sometimes it didn't seat right. She had taped it, retaped it, tried to make it behave. She folded a small note and tucked it deep in her kit. It wasn't a love letter. It wasn't a talisman in any mystical sense. It was a reminder written in a hand she no longer heard in the world. Paper was fragile in this environment, but she kept it anyway, careful, protected, like a weight she had chosen to carry. The convoy rolled out as the sun climbed. The mountains looked beautiful, dangerous beauty, the kind that made people relax because they didn't want to admit they were nervous. The road cut through the corridor, tires crunching. Snow glittered. The sky was clear. Visibility was perfect. Perfect, Harper thought, is a trap. Halfway through the corridor, she saw it. A distant metallic glint on a ridge line, just for an instant. Not sunlight on rock. Too clean, too sharp. Like glass. Like a lens. She blinked. Looked again. The glint was gone. The ridge looked empty. The others were talking on the radio about timing and spacing. Nobody else seemed to notice. Harper didn't speak. She watched. When the trap sprang, it did so with the confidence of a plan that had been rehearsed. The too quiet stretch arrived like a held breath. The road dipped into the shallow bowl. The snowbanks rose. The ridges leaned in. The convoy's sound changed. Engines echoing differently. Tires crunching louder, as if the landscape itself wanted to announce them. The first contact was surgical. A sharp crack. A shout. The radio operator in the second vehicle jerked, hand flying to his shoulder. Blood appeared fast, bright against his winter gear. He didn't die. He dropped the handset like it had burned him. His face tightened, jaw clenched, eyes wide with the surprise of pain. It was a message. They knew who mattered. The radios crackled. Static surged. Then the sound became useless noise. Another operator tried to relay. His voice vanished into hiss. The convoy's digital lifeline was cut, not by chance or weather, but by intent. The enemy used layered fires. One team pinned the front vehicle. Another cut the rear. Bursts snapped in controlled patterns, forcing heads down and limiting movement to inches. The Khrushchev gun started its heavy work from the high ground, walking rounds across the exit lane like it owned the road. Harper pressed her back to the armored SUV and listened for rhythm beneath the noise. There was rhythm, not in the gunfire itself, but in the way it shifted. The fight breathed. When the Khrushchev gun paused, rifles surged. When rifles paused, a single precision shooter took a shot. It wasn't chaos. It was coordinated. Somewhere in that coordination was a brain. Visibility collapsed in flashes. Snow erupted from impacts. Vehicle exhaust mixed with smoke and wind. One moment she could see the ridge line clearly. The next it disappeared behind a thin veil that made distance meaningless. Ammo began to matter quickly. Suppressive fire felt good in the moment. It felt like doing something. It felt like pushing back. But magazines emptied, and each reload was a small panic you hid behind discipline. The escort leader started signaling for controlled bursts, fewer rounds, tighter shots. He didn't say ration out loud. He didn't have to. Everyone felt the weight of dwindling metal. The wounded man at the rear screamed again, and the scream vanished into the wind. Blood soaked into the snow. A medic crawled to him, low, hands moving fast. The casualty became the emotional anchor, the proof that the trap was real and that mistakes would be paid for immediately. The general's detail followed the book. Move to hard cover. Keep the principal low. Shift to the outcrop. Guard the flanks. The enemy punished it. Rounds bracketed the outcrop before they arrived, as if the enemy had drawn a diagram and checked it off. A bow snapped low, forcing a bodyguard to drop. A single shot cracked near the general's head, close enough that his bodyguards flinched as one. Harper watched the ridge where she'd seen the glint. The obvious shooters were on the nearest high ground, muzzle flashes faint in the glare. They were important, but they weren't the whole thing. The breathing of the fight was coming from farther left, from a spine of rock that looked empty and yet felt central. She noticed a small detail that didn't fit the rest of the scene. A slight, unnatural straightness in the air above that ridge, like heat shimmer but cold. An antenna, perhaps, hidden against the rock. A case. A small piece of equipment that didn't belong to the mountain. Jammer. That would explain the radios dying in waves. That would explain the enemy's confidence. Cut the unit off, force them into predictable moves, then herd them. Herd them toward what? Harper's gaze flicked down to the bowl again. The enemy wasn't trying to wipe them out immediately. If they wanted everyone dead, the Khrushchev gun would have cut deeper, the RPGs would have hit the vehicles directly, the shooters would have poured fire into the cluster until nothing moved. Instead, the fire shaped them, pressed them, funneled them, toward a point where capture could happen. A moral constraint flashed in her mind as she saw the local partner driver near the rear vehicle, crouched low, eyes wide, frozen. If she fired into the wrong lane to stop the push, she could hit the wrong person in this glare and smoke. Collateral in snow was tricky. White swallowed shapes. Shadows lied. A broken message crackled through for a moment. Extraction. Delayed. Window. Then the hiss swallowed it again. Delayed meant time pressure. It meant the enemy had more minutes to tighten the noose. It meant the general's presence was now a liability in a place that was already geometry and death. The escort leader signaled. Hold. Cover. Stay tight. Harper didn't argue. She didn't ask permission. She waited for the enemy's breath. When the Khrushchev gun paused, when the rifle fire shifted, when the smoke veiled the line of sight for a heartbeat, she moved. Not running. Not dramatic. A controlled slide away from the cluster, using the vehicle's shadows and a low drift. She vanished from the group the way a thought disappears when you're interrupted. Nobody had time to notice. She chose a route that looked suicidal. A wind-scoured side slope rose to her left, where the snow was thin and crusted. It was loud underfoot if you moved wrong. It was exposed, but it had one advantage. At certain angles, the glare turned everything into brightness, and movement could hide in the absence of contrast. Harper moved in slow weight shifts, placing her boot carefully, testing crust. She used rock ribs that broke the slope into segments. She paused when fire cadence spiked, counting in her head, timing her movement to the enemy's own bursts. It was a strange kind of dance, silence and violence, timing and patience. Her optics started to betray her. Cold crept into the glass, a faint fogging at the edges. Snow crust clung to the lens hood. She cleared it carefully with a gloved thumb, keeping her body low, refusing to flash against the slope. Comms were dead. That meant she was alone. Not emotionally, not in purpose, but in coordination. She could not tell the escort leader what she was doing. She could not ask for confirmation. She could only predict how her team would behave under pressure, and she could only read the enemy as if their choices were a language. She reached a narrow spine, an outcropping that ran like a blade between two slopes. From here, she could see into the bowl from the side, an angle that wasn't obvious on a map and hard to access if you weren't willing to climb. The enemy likely discounted it because it looked like effort, because it looked like risk. Harper counted rounds. Not many. Enough for a plan if the plan was precise. Not enough for heroics. From this angle, the fight's brain became clearer. On the far left ridge, partially hidden behind rock, a small cluster of enemy fighters moved differently than the rest. Not the ones firing, the ones signaling. One held something like a handset. Another hovered near a small case with a thin antenna. Their posture wasn't aggressive. It was managerial. They weren't in the front of the fight. They were controlling it. A drone skimmed the ridge line above them, small, insect-like against the sky. It wasn't a big military machine. It was a cheap thing, adapted, used to spot movement and confirm kills. It drifted, searching for exactly the kind of flanking shooter Harper represented. Harper became still. Snow camo and stillness were their own armor. The drone passed, its operator's attention focused on obvious shapes. Men running, rifles flashing, smoke plumes. Harper didn't move like a threat. She became a rock with a heartbeat. In that stillness, a memory slid in. A different range. A different cold. Sniper school. She had been on the final evaluation, prone behind a rifle, instructor watching, timer running. A target had stepped into the lane, an enemy silhouette, perfect shot. And behind it, a civilian role player had moved into the frame. The rules had been clear. The expectation had been clear. The school wanted decisiveness. It wanted the shot taken the moment the target appeared. Harper had held. She had watched. She had waited for separation that never came. The timer had run out. The instructor had called it. Failure. Not because she couldn't shoot. Because she wouldn't shoot through the wrong person. Because she refused to make a good enough decision that would have killed an innocent, even in training. She had been labeled hesitant, weak, unsuited. The papers said she failed, and paper mattered to people who didn't understand what she'd chosen. She touched the folded note in her kit without looking at it, feeling its edge through fabric. It belonged to someone who had once told her that the hardest shot wasn't the one you took, it was the one you didn't. Someone she'd lost because of a rushed decision by a different shooter, years ago, when good enough had been used like an excuse. Harper let the memory sharpen her instead of soften her. She set her rifle on the spine, controlled her breathing, and waited. She didn't need the whole fight. She needed one target that mattered most. A target ladder formed in her mind like a list written in clean ink. First, the control. The jammer. Cut the enemy's grip on the air. Second, the Q-served gun. Break the no-move line. Third, the RPG team. Keep the vehicles from becoming coffins. Then the leaders. The spotters. The people who made the others brave. Harper watched the case with the antenna. The jammer operator leaned toward it, adjusting something. A glove hand moved over the controls. His posture was relaxed in a way fighters only got when they believed they owned the situation. Harper squeezed. The rifle bucked into her shoulder with familiar force. The shot cracked through the wind and vanished into the bright day. The jammer operator jerked backward, collapsing against the rock. The antenna dipped. The case shifted. For a heartbeat, nothing changed. Then Harper heard it, faint, like a ghost. A fragment of friendly radio, weak but present. The hiss was still there, but something had loosened. The enemy's grip on the air had slipped. In the bowl, the enemy fire stuttered. Not because they were scared. Because coordination had been disrupted. Because the breathing rhythm lost its cue. Harper didn't celebrate. She didn't rush. She paused. Micro-pause. Letting the recoil settle. Letting her sight picture return. Letting the fight reveal what was next. The Crusoe gun on the high ground was still the biggest threat. It held the exit lane like a hand on a throat. Harper found the gun team by behavior. The loader's repeated reach, the gunner's lean, the leader's head movement. The leader had a slightly different posture. He watched the ball more than the gun, directing, controlling. Harper squeezed again. The leader snapped down, dropping behind the weapon. The gun fell silent for a beat, then erupted in a wild, less controlled burst. The line across the exit lane wavered. The no-move line cracked. In the bowl, the escort leader saw it. He didn't need to know why it happened. He only needed to see that it had. He signaled. 2 fingers forward. Move the wounded. Shift the vehicles. Push toward the least covered but now least watched exit seam. Harper tracked the RPG team next. They were lower on the ridge, using rocks as cover. One held the launcher. Another carried the rounds. They waited for the moment vehicles moved, ready to punch a hole in metal and morale. Harper found the assistant first, the one who carried rounds, the one who made the launcher a repeat threat. She squeezed. He dropped, the round slipping from his grip, disappearing into snow. The launcher man hesitated, suddenly aware that someone had eyes on him from somewhere he couldn't see. The enemy didn't freeze. They adapted. The drone that had skimmed earlier turned sharply and came back, now moving with purpose. It wasn't searching for obvious movement anymore. It was searching for the absence of movement, for the places a shooter would choose. 2 climbers peeled off from the ridge and started flanking toward Harper's spine. They moved low, careful, using rock and snow, climbing in the same slow weight shifts Harper had used. They understood the mountain. They understood counterhunt. Harper's optic fogged harder. The edges of her sight picture blurred. The cold had found its way into the glass. She could still shoot, but she would have to rely more on silhouette, on behavior, on the faint differences between rock and human shape. Below, the bowl shifted. Friendly forces exploited the opening Harper had created. The wounded man was dragged, leaving a smear in the snow. Vehicles angled, tires biting. The general was moved, bodyguards low, faces tight. Enemy fire surged again, trying to re-establish control, but it was now fragmented. Teams fired independently. The breathing rhythm was gone. Without the jammer operator and the ridge control, the enemy had lost the smoothness that made an ambush feel like destiny. The drone's shadow passed over Harper's position like a cold hand. She didn't flinch. She shifted inches, not feet, sliding along the spine into a small dead angle where rock's shadow broke up her outline. One wrong movement could flash against the slope, and the drone would paint her for the climbers. The enemy tried to bait her. Down in the bowl, a fighter stepped into view near the general's cover, bold, exposed, almost inviting. Harper's crosshairs settled on him automatically. He was close enough that a hit would matter. He raised his rifle as if to fire at the general. And then Harper saw the problem. A local partner, crouched low near the vehicles, was too close to the line. The glare made distance tricky. A slight shift, a slip, and the shot could pass through the wrong space. Harper held. The decoy fired anyway, rounds cracking into rock. The bodyguards flinched. The general stayed low. The escort leader cursed without sound, lips moving in a word Harper couldn't hear. The decoy wasn't there to kill. He was there to make Harper reveal herself, to make her take a rushed good enough shot. Harper refused. The memory of sniper school wasn't a weakness now. It was armor. It kept her from being manipulated. She looked past the decoy. The true commander was not the one acting brave. The true commander was calm, central, slightly back, watching, controlling, the one whose head turned in small, precise movements, tracking the whole fight. Harper found him on the ridge near the now-fallen jammer operator, partially concealed, directing with hand signals and short shouts that the wind carried away. The climbers were closer now. Harper could hear it, faint crunching steps, the clink of gear against rock. The counter-hunt was tightening. Seconds were becoming expensive. Harper squeezed. The commander's head snapped. His body folded. He dropped behind the rock as if gravity had suddenly doubled. Down in the bowl, the enemy cohesion broke like ice. It wasn't dramatic in the way movies liked. It was practical. Without the commander, teams lost their cue. One group surged forward too early and ran into crossfire. Another group started pulling back, suddenly uncertain. The Khrushchev gun fired wildly, no longer walking the exit lane with confident discipline. The RPG man fired a shot that hit snow instead of metal because he rushed. The trap turned into a scramble. Friendly movement became possible. The escort leaders signaled hard. Go, go, go. Vehicles pushed. Operators ran low alongside, covering with controlled bursts. The general was moved with both hands on him, bodyguards using their bodies as shields. Harper's problem now wasn't targets. It was survival. The drone dipped, searching, now almost directly above. The climbers were close enough that Harper could feel their presence, even without seeing them. If she stayed to shoot more, she would be caught. If she moved too fast, she would flash. She needed one more force multiplier to cut the counter-hunt's eyes. The drone operator. Harper tracked the drone's movement backward, imagining the line of control. The operator would be positioned where he could see the ridge and the bowl. He would have a clear view. He would be sheltered from direct fire. He would be close enough to the command node to feed information. She found him by a small depression, half behind rock, his posture tilted upward, hands tight around a controller. Harper squeezed. He dropped forward, the controller slipping from his hands. The drone wobbled, drifted, then began a slow, confused circle as if it had lost its mind. The climbers hesitated. Their hunt had been guided by eyes in the sky. Without those eyes, they were suddenly climbing blind into bright glare and rock shadow. They crouched, scanning, rifles up, but their certainty was gone. Harper slid downslope into a dead angle. Not running, not crashing, a controlled descent, using gravity as quietly as possible. She disappeared into the folds of the mountain the way she had disappeared from the convoy earlier, like a thought interrupted. Down in the corridor, radios began to return in ragged fragments. Move. Window. The extraction element committed. A distant thump-thump-thump of rotor blades carried faintly through the valley, not close yet but real. The escort leader heard it and pushed harder. The convoy's movement became purposeful, no longer trapped in the bowl's geometry. Enemy fire followed them, but it was disorganized. Shots cracked, impacts kicked up snow, but the careful stitching was gone. The pre-planned lanes no longer fit the fight because the fight had changed shape. The general was moved under renewed but scattered fire. A bodyguard took a graze across the shoulder and kept moving. The wounded man was loaded into a vehicle, medic pressing down on the bleeding with both hands. The convoy pushed out of the kill zone, out of the bowl, tires clawing for traction. Behind them, the enemy's ambush machine sputtered without its key parts. And somewhere on the ridgeline, Harper lay in a hollow of snow and rock, chest rising and falling slowly, listening to the fight fade, waiting for the moment it was safe to move again. When she returned, it wasn't with drama. It was with patience. The convoy reached a staging area farther down the corridor, where the road widened and ridges pulled back. The snow glare was still brutal, but the sense of being watched from every angle eased. Operators set security in a wider circle. Weapons stayed up, but shoulders loosened by millimeters. Medics worked the wounded with the calm urgency of people who had done it too many times. The general sat on the back bumper of a vehicle for a moment, head down, hands gloved, breathing through the reality of how close it had been. His bodyguard stood around him like a wall that refused to crack. In the debrief space, a cleared patch of snow near the vehicles, voices finally returned. Radios crackled with clearer signal now, the jamming gone. The escort leader spoke in clipped sentences, recounting the ambush, the casualty, the movements. His eyes were bloodshot from glare and adrenaline. Then Harper walked in from the edge of the staging area, dusted with snow, face calm, rifle slung, moving like she hadn't just been hunted on a ridgeline. She looked almost ordinary until someone noticed her hands. They were steady now, but her gloves were damp at the fingertips, as if she'd gripped the rifle too hard for too long. Her eyes were focused in a way that suggested she was still somewhere else in her head, still tracing angles, still watching for movement. The escort leader stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. "Where the hell?" he started. Harper didn't answer with a story. She didn't need to. She just looked toward the ridges, toward the place where the ambush had been shaped, and the escort leader's mind filled in the missing pieces. An analyst, one of the quiet staff types who followed missions with tablets and questions, held up a recovered piece of equipment. The small case with the antenna. The jammer. A recording kit strapped to it with cheap ties. They weren't just trying to kill, the analyst said. They were trying to capture, document it. Propaganda. They needed the general alive, and they needed access codes tied to the sensor network. Harper felt something cold settle in her chest. Not surprise. Exactly. Confirmation. The enemy had been competent and intentional. They had pre-surveyed the corridor, timed the daylight glare, and relied on predictable protocol to herd the security detail into a capture point. The jammed comms, the bracketing fire, the controlled no-move line, none of it was random. Until someone unpredictable broke their math. The escort leader looked at Harper again, and his expression shifted from irritation to something heavier. "You saved the unit," he said. Not loud, not for drama, just a statement that carried weight. "You saved him." He nodded toward the general. The general stood, moving carefully like someone whose body had remembered Faye. He walked over to Harper with only one bodyguard, a small gesture that meant trust. He didn't deliver a speech. He didn't praise her in front of everyone like a politician. He met her eyes. "I know what you did," he said, voice low. The words were simple, and they were enough. He nodded once, small, firm, the kind of nod that meant institutional gravity without showmanship. Then he stepped back, letting his detail pull him away. Harper didn't smile. She didn't know how to fit gratitude into a body that still felt like it was on that ridge, listening to crunching steps behind her. She didn't want to be the center of a circle. She wanted to be back in the edges where the air was clearer. Later, when the staging area quieted, when vehicles were being checked and ammo counted and the wounded was stabilized for movement, Harper sat alone for a moment behind a snowbank that blocked her from everyone else's eyes. Her hands started to tremble. Not violently, not uncontrollably, just enough to reveal what adrenaline did when it had nowhere to go. She pressed her gloves together, fingers interlaced, forcing steadiness. She breathed in, counted, breathed out. Fear had been there the whole time. She hadn't been fearless. She had been functional. She pulled the folded note from her kit and held it between gloved fingers, not opening it, just feeling the paper's edge. A reminder of why she held fire when others would have rushed. A reminder that integrity was not a luxury. It was a discipline. Sniper school had called her choice a failure. Today, that same choice had kept her from shooting through the wrong person when the enemy tried to bait her. It had kept the moral line clean when the glare and smoke wanted to blur it. It had made her patience stronger than the enemy's manipulation. In the debrief, analysts spoke about the turning point as if it were a clean equation. When the commander went down, everything fractured, one said. The ambush lost cohesion. They were right. Precision had outperformed brute force because it had struck the right note. But it wasn't just math. It was judgment. It was a willingness to see what others ignored and to move when nobody expected it. When Harper stood and rejoined the group, the way people looked at her had changed. Not in a dramatic way. Not instantly. Respect in this world rarely arrived with applause. It arrived in small shifts. In people making room. in questions asked without condescension, in the escort leader handing her a fresh magazine without a joke attached. Belonging, Harper thought, was earned in silence, not demanded. The convoy moved again as the afternoon light began to soften, the mountains preparing their weather shift like a curtain about to fall. The corridor behind them looked almost untouched from a distance, snow smoothing over tracks and blood and churned earth with indifferent patience. If you didn't know what had happened, you could look at the ridges and see only beauty. Bright snow, hard rock, clear sky, a clean world that kept its secrets well, covering footprints as if the ridgeline had never held a quiet figure watching angles, waiting for the one shot that would pull the plug on an enemy plan. And somewhere under the hum of engines and the crackle of radios that worked again, Harper carried her note, her ethics, and the quiet cost of being the one who saved everyone without ever needing anyone to see her do it.